Howdy folks, it's Rob with MTG Investor, and before I get going on this video, I just want to tell you, I know it's long, I know it's a long video, but please bear with me so that you can understand the fundamentals of how I evaluate cards. Please try to get through it, and it'll explain a lot of questions, so if you skip this video, then you're probably going to be asking yourself, why am I doing this, why am I doing that? But if you listen to this video, at least it's going to give you a good basis to know how I look at things, and it'll help you improve as an investor in MTG cards. So without further ado, here we go. Howdy folks, it's Rob with MTG Investor. Today's April 2nd, 2015, and I'm kicking off a video series on the top 25 modern cards to invest in. These are the 25 cards that I personally would put money in. I actually made a list of 92 cards to be precise, and then I narrowed it down to the top 50, and I ranked those top 50. But we're going to be looking at the top 25. Maybe someday I'll go back and revisit 26 through 50. But if you don't see a card on my list, you're welcome to leave a comment and ask about it or find out what I think about it. I'll be releasing this series in increments of 5 cards each over the next week. I'm going to put 5 cards in each video so that I can spend a little extra time discussing why I think each card's going to do what it's going to do over the course of the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. I am a long-term investor, so when I invest in a card, I look and see what is this card going to do, 1 or 2 or 3 years down the road. That's where you're going to get the best growth for things I'm looking in. I'll be releasing a series also on Legacy and EDH in the near future. Some of the cards on this list of the modern cards will cross over into Legacy, and some will actually cross over into EDH. There's actually an EDH card on my top 25 list that I went ahead and threw on the modern list because I wanted to get it out now because I have a feeling that it's going to start moving in price pretty quickly, and I wanted to let people know about it now, so I went ahead and threw it on my EDH list. This series is not about what's the most expensive card. It's not about what's the most played card. Obviously, Tarmogoyf would be at the top of at least the most expensive cards, and pretty close to the top on the most played cards. So it's not about that. If I told you to invest in Tarmogoyf but it only went up $10 in the next 2 years, then that's not a good return on your investment. So what I'm looking at is cards that are going to give me a lot of money on my return. So if I buy it for $1 and it becomes $5, then I have a tremendous return on my investment. So keep that in mind when you see me evaluating the cards and what I have to say about them. So it's all about which cards can get me the most money in the future. Alright, well, let's get this going. We're going to start this off by looking at the criteria I use for investing. There's several criteria, but there's 2 primary criterion I use when I look at a card. They are stability and growth potential. And I'm going to break those down for you so you can have an idea what that means to me. So let's take a look at stability. Some of the questions I ask myself about stability would be things like, will this card ever be reprinted? When a card gets reprinted, then the value of the card is going to come down. So I need to ask myself, what is the possibility that this card will ever be reprinted? And some of the things that I might ask is this card currently in a core set? Was it in an M15, 14, 13, etc.? If a card shows up in a core set, and I know that they're doing away with quote-unquote core sets, but that doesn't mean those cards won't ever come back. They've already stated that those cards will still be filtered in the regular sets instead of in the core sets. And they might do some special summer prints like they did for Cold Snap or the new set that's coming out in the summer of 2015, Magic Origins. But anyway, we're going to take a look. So if this was printed in a core set, then that means the probability of being reprinted are fairly high. There are cards that were in expansions that are reprinted, and that happens. So if this card is a staple and it has a history of reprints, or it appears in a core set, then the probability of being reprinted is going to be increased. Therefore, the stability of this card decreases in my mind. So, for instance, when Scavenging Ooze came out in one of the Commander sets, it was a pretty expensive card. Then it got reprinted in, is it M15 it got reprinted in? Something like that. And Anyway, the value came down. So now you have to ask yourself, will Scavenging Ooze be reprinted again? So that's something you have to take a look at. You ideally want to invest in cards that aren't going to see reprinting. Is this card so unique, or is it so wacky that Wizards doesn't want to reprint it? That's a big bonus on the card. Also, let's look at the next thing. Number 2, does this card see play in other formats? This one's a big one. So there's cards on my Modern Top 25 that also will appear on my Legacy Top 25. And there are cards that will also be on my EDH Top 25. So if you see a card that shows up in multiple formats, then it has high stability. It can absorb potential reprintings because there is a vastly larger player base that has interest in this card. So, for instance, things like Delver of Secrets shows up in Modern, shows up in Legacy, shows up in Vintage, shows up in EDH. So that's a card that shows up in all formats. That's a big bonus to its stability. Now, the other thing is, let's take Delver for instance. Will Delver ever be reprinted? It's unlikely that it'll be reprinted. I would say, if I had to guess, no. Well, so you have to kind of also think about a time range. So you can't say, will the card ever be reprinted? If Magic continues for another 100 years, then Delver of Secrets has a high probability of being reprinted. So we have to think in the context of time. So I usually think in 5-year increments. So will this card see reprint in the next 5 years? And for in Delver's case, I don't think it will. I don't think it will. All right. So number 3, will new cards obsolete this one? And this one is a really important one because I'm going to give you a good case that's going on right now. So for instance, in Modern, Combust was the go-to card to deal with Splinter Twin decks. It does 5 damage to a blue or white creature, can't be countered, instant speed, a red and 1. Now, along came Rending Volley with Dragons of Tarkir. And now we have a 1 red mana spell that does the same thing. It does 1 less damage. It deals with Splinter Twin creatures for 1 red mana. Now, Combust has 1 positive over Rending Volley, and that is that it does the 1 extra damage, so it can kill Siege Rhino. But Siege Rhino is not getting a tremendous amount of play in Modern right now. It's getting a little bit, but to be honest with you, I would probably choose Rending Volley over Combust just because it's half the mana cost. And I usually play very fast aggro decks, and that 1 extra mana might prevent me from casting a threat and holding up mana. Or, Twin will tap down your mana, so at the end of turn with their creatures, and so that 1 mana is huge, in my opinion. So if I feel comfortable against all the other the field of decks, then Rending Volley is the way I'm going to go. So, in a way, Rending Volley might obsolete Combust to a degree. Now, people are still playing Combust because Rhino is in the format, but Rhino may not last. Rhino might just be a flash in the pan. So, that's something you have to think about. Are there cards that could be reprinted that would obsolete this card? So, next we're going to look at number 4. Don't fall in love with cards. This comes right from my days of trading stocks. There's an old adage in stock trading, don't fall in love with the stock. Don't trade with your heart, trade with your mind. So you cannot fall in love with cards. You may be absolutely in love with Siege Rhino, but that doesn't mean that Siege Rhino is going to be a great card in the Modern format today, tomorrow, 5 years from now. So you need to remove your love of cards from the equation. You need to think with your head. So that's why I try to break this down to numbers, which we're going to get to in just a second. And number 5, will it maintain its base value? So I alluded to this in some previous videos. If the card falls off and becomes unplayable, we'll look at Siege Rhino for instance. So if Siege Rhino rotates out, it's no longer in print, but it's getting play in Modern, then the value is going to go up. Now, Siege Rhino is not a card that's getting a lot of play in Modern. It's getting a little bit of play. That little bit of play will boost its value. But if it stops getting play, then Siege Rhino will fall in price. So this is where this comes in. If Siege Rhino doesn't see play, will Siege Rhino hold its value? Is there a reason for it to hold its value? And if there is, then that's a bonus for it in the stability category. So next we're going to look at growth potential. and what that means to me. So, some of the questions I might ask myself with growth potential. Will new players want this card? And what this means is, if a card's printed today, well, let's say Khans of Tarkir. Khans of Tarkir is going to rotate out in the spring 2016 expansion set. So when Khans rotates out, it's going to go out of print. It won't be print any longer. And so all the players that come into Magic in spring 2016 and after spring 2016, if these people want to play Modern, they're going to have to buy cards that are out of print. Meaning they're going to have to spend money on cards, and when they spend money on the cards, the demand goes up and the value of the cards goes up. So are you going to get a hold of cards that players are going to want? So that's something that you need to think about. If it's a card that doesn't see or have a lot of interest, it's a fringe card, then the growth potential on it is going to be lower. So you need to think, will new players want to scoop this up? So right now, what you've seen on Tarmogoyf, I don't know how new or old of a player you've been, Tarmogoyf is crazy expensive, right? It's $200 a card. Because players want it. Players want to have that card, and new players that come into the game see this is one of the very best creatures in Magic, and we want to get a hold of it because it's power level. So this is a perfect example of will new players want this card. Yes. Alright, number 2. How much play did this card see in Standard? This actually has quite a bit to do with the value of a card. So, for instance, Tarmogoyf, we'll continue with Tarmogoyf because it's a good example. Tarmogoyf saw play in Standard, but it didn't see an extreme absorbent amount of play in Standard because the format didn't dictate that Tarmogoyf could be so abusable in Standard. Now, I played in the time of Time Spiral Block when Future Sight came out, and the PTQs at that time were block constructed, so they were Time Spiral Block. And Tarmogoyf saw quite a bit of play in block constructed, but that was a relatively small format compared to Standard. So yes, Tarmogoyf was really big there, and that's actually what drove the price of Tarmogoyf come out. When Tarmogoyf first came out, it was like a $2 card, and it stayed at a $2 card for quite a while. When block season started, then players constructed decks to get artifacts, enchantments, lands, all kinds of things in the yard really fast to build up Tarmogoyf. And in block constructed, there was enough time for players to do that. They didn't have to deal with immediate threats. It wasn't like Legacy or Modern to a degree where bam, turn 1, turn 2, threat. And block constructed, it's usually a slower format. So Tarmogoyf had some time to grow. It didn't have to come down on turn 2 and be a 4/5 already at that point. So Tarmogoyf could come down later, turn 3, turn 4, and be effective then. Now in Standard, Standard played differently. Standard played much slower at the time. So Tarmogoyf didn't see a ton of play. And because of that, Tarmogoyf wasn't as highly sought after while it was in print. People were picking it up, but a lot of people questioned. The card shot up to about $25 while it was in Standard, and people were questioning, why is this worth $25? It's just a creature that requires stuff in the yard. And so people didn't want to trade for Tarmogoyf. There was a lot of people, and I know some of you may have been ahead of the curve on this. Some of you may have seen the long-term value, but I'm saying that there was a lot of players who didn't. A lot of players didn't pick up on that. Then factor in the fact that Tarmogoyf was in Future Sight, which was the third set of the block. Third sets of the blocks get printed less than other sets in the block because it's the third one. Not as many packs are open because when you draft, the third set gets the least openings. And it's actually, in the format, the shortest amount of time. The first two sets see more time in the format under the old rotation and the current rotation. So you had all these factors saying there wasn't as much Future Sight opened. People weren't gaga for Tarmogoyf. So there was less demand, and so there was less Tarmogoyfs out there. Now, if you look at Snapcaster Mage saw play in Standard, saw a lot of play in Standard. That's why the value of Snapcaster didn't increase as quickly as Tarmogoyf did. Now, we'll talk about Snapcaster later in the top 25 videos, but you have to kind of understand how Standard influences the prices because, for instance, Rhinos are everywhere right now in the current Standard format, Siege Rhino. So it's going to diminish. It's going to take longer for that card to increase in value because it's such a heavy player in the Standard format. There's tons of Rhinos around. So that's going to be a factor for its long-term value. All right, let's move on to number 3. Spend a lot of time on number 2. All right, is this a staple card? And this is a no-brainer. Is this card a staple in the format? The Splinter Twin, the enchantment, is a staple in the format. There's a lot of cards that are staples in the format. Lightning Bolt is a staple in the format. These are played in, well, Splinter Twins played in basically one deck, but Lightning Bolt's played all across the board. Liliana's played quite a few decks. So if cards are staples, then that's going to play into number 1, will new players want this card? Yes, so that's something you need to keep in mind. Because fringe cards, sideboard cards are in general less valuable than main deck cards. So main deck cards, cause this is kind of number 3 what I'm saying, like main deck cards are going to be bigger players than sideboard cards. Now, number 4, how many decks will utilize it? And I just mentioned that. So you have to ask yourself, Lightning Bolt goes into a ton of decks in Modern, and Splinter Twin goes into basically one deck in the format. And so that's something to consider also. If multiple decks are playing the card, then there's higher demand, and the potential for it to grow is higher. Okay, number 5, does this card get better with time? Now, this is one that a lot of people overlook, meaning over time, does the printing of more cards increase the power level of this card? So, for instance, let's look at Affinity. Affinity was a deck for a while in Extended. It was a good Extended deck. Well, I should say it was back when Modern was called Extended. It was a good Extended deck, and then other decks caught up to it and passed it up. And it was still around, but it wasn't a big player. Then there was cards that came along that got printed that increased the power level of Affinity. Affinity doesn't have their artifact lands anymore to play with for the most part, so there's only a couple. But there are cards like Springleaf Drum. Springleaf Drum came along, and it helped revitalize Affinity. So when you look at a card, you have to think, is there a good chance that Wizards will make a card that increases the power level of this card? And generally, yes, that's the case. In the case of Tarmogoyf, when Tarmogoyf came out, there wasn't anything. Well, actually, there was one tribal card, I believe, in Future Sight. I think there was one, if I recall, one tribal card. But before that, there was no tribal, and there was no Planeswalkers. Planeswalkers didn't get printed until Lorwyn. So Tarmogoyf increased in its power when tribal was printed and when Planeswalkers were printed. So bam, it just became even bigger card, even more powerful card. So you kind of have to think in terms of, could there be a card printed that would increase the value of this? So like when I'm looking at the card Commune with Lava from Dragons of Tarkir, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, is this card playable right now? Perhaps. But could there be cards printed in the future that will make this card more playable, more usable, more powerful? Yes, I think there's a good chance of that. So I might want to scoop in and get some Commune with Lavas, because I think one day it could be a player in a deck. If it isn't, oh well, I didn't really waste that much money. And if I hit on it, then bam, it helps me out if I have some cards that aren't winners. So anyway, that's something you want to think about. There's a lot of great examples through the history of Magic of, do cards get better with time? So anyway, let's look at our next part of the video. Go ahead and click the link over to the second part of this video and we'll continue there.